Does TikTok put your personal data and our national security at risk? The White House thinks so. But in an exclusive interview with NBC News, TikTok's head of U.S. operations says it does not. Here's NBC News business and tech correspondent Jolene Kent.
Hey, Allison, TikTok has about 100 million U.S. users alone. And for the first time since the president's executive order ordering TikTok to sell itself to a U.S. company and the next month, the company is speaking out. The head of U.S. operations sat down with me at the beach house in Santa Monica for an exclusive interview. And she says the company is 100% prepared to guard against any cybersecurity threats. TikTok, the wildly popular viral video app, now with a target on its back.
It has to be proven to be totally secure. We don't want to have any information going into China with what we've been through.
The social media platform owned by the Chinese tech company ByteDance being forced by President Trump in an executive order to sell itself to an American company by September 15th, accusing it of being a threat to national security. The company clapping back.
So, no, we're not a national security threat, and we've said that time and again. We have very strict data controls in place. We have an amazing team building a world-class infrastructure, and it's something that we put front and center in terms of protecting our users.
Then what do you think President Trump is talking about when he says credible threat?
I think, we are at a time where we're seeing very much a geopolitical tension, as you know, between the U.S. and China, and we are in the middle of that.
According to the New York Times, a new CIA report finds there is, quote, no evidence Chinese intelligence has accessed user data on TikTok, but there are still major concerns about privacy and security. With a third of all TikTok users reportedly under the age of 13, the company says they provide the tools for parents to safeguard their kids.
We have an under 13 experience for those young users to make sure that it's a really limited content experience. Even if you're 16 and under, we don't allow direct messaging. We don't allow you to go live streaming. Parents can actually monitor the type of content that their kids are seeing, as well as set screen time controls.
Does TikTok sell user information?
No.
Not at all?
No, we don't. We certainly have advertisers who advertise onto the platform, but in terms of the data that we have on users, it's very similar to other social media platforms, if not less.
The prospect of TikTok being sold to a company like Microsoft has users worried their beloved community will change or, worse, disappear. Amid the controversy, Instagram launching its own version.
How worried are you that users are going to leave TikTok for Instagram Reels?
So I would say you can certainly copy a feature, but you can't copy a community. And I think what's really unique about TikTok is this amazing community that has found a home on the platform.
Along with the executive order, new competition, and the 2020 general election, TikTok is trying to learn from the mistakes of other social media giants.
There is content on TikTok that is anti-vaccination. There's COVID deniers. Can you commit to removing that content?
Yes, we do. So once we detect it, we remove it immediately. So we have some of the strictest policies out of all social platforms.
The hope, survive this sale and beyond.
Is TikTok going to be around in a month?
TikTok is here for the long run. We've been called the last sunny spot of the internet. We're really proud of this ability for human connection and just having this space for just joy and fun. When was the last time you were able to just say, hey, I went on social media and it was a fun experience?
While TikTok maintains the app poses no national security threat to U.S. users or anyone around the world, we did check in with the White House for their reaction to the interview. A senior administration official tells us that apps like TikTok collect significant amounts of private data on users, and such information can be accessed and used by the Chinese government at its own discretion. This presents an unacceptable threat to the security of our nation and its citizens. So certainly a lot of battling coming up ahead of that September 15th deadline. Allison?
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.